The deed hit the table between them like a gunshot. Elara Rowe stared at the paper, her hands trembling so badly she had to press them flat against the worn oak surface to stop them. The ink was dry. The signatures were witnessed. The sum paid in full. Every last cent she had owed the Cattlemen's Bank of Colby, Kansas, cleared in a single transaction she had known nothing about until 30 seconds ago. "You bought my farm," she said, and her voice came out barely above a whisper, which was the opposite of what she intended. She had intended fury. She had intended a force of will that would send this man, this silent, infuriatingly composed stranger, backing toward the door. Instead, the words fell out of her like stones dropped into still water. Zane Briggs looked at her from across the table with those gray eyes that seemed to have seen every kind of weather and survived all of it. He was leaning against the doorframe of her kitchen, arms crossed, hat pushed back on his head. Dust still clung to the shoulders of his dark coat. He hadn't even cleaned up before coming to deliver this particular catastrophe. "Paid off the debt," he said carefully. "The deed transfers to my name effective yesterday. You had no right." The trembling in her hands moved up through her arms. "You had absolutely no right to do that. Bank was going to foreclose inside of a week. You knew that. That was my problem to solve." She shoved back from the table and stood, needing the height of standing even though she was still half a foot shorter than him. "This was my land, my father's land. And now you come in here and wave a piece of paper in my face and tell me what exactly? That I should be grateful." He unfolded his arms and straightened. "I didn't say anything about grateful." "Then what?" The question came out raw, almost broken, and she hated it. She hated that her voice had that particular crack in it, the one that meant she was closer to tears than to screaming. "What am I supposed to do now? Where am I supposed to go?" Zane Briggs looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet around them, the kind of quiet that only existed in the middle of the Kansas plains in late October, when the wind had briefly stopped and everything was holding its breath. He reached into his coat pocket and set something else on the table beside the deed. A second document. She looked at it without touching it. "That's a lease agreement," he said. "Fair terms. Gives you the right to work this land and live on it same as always, $1 a year." She stared at the paper, then she looked up at him. "Now you have no reason to go," he said quietly, "unless you want to." That was 3 weeks ago. Elara had not left. She should have. Every practical, self-preserving bone in her body told her that staying was a mistake of the particular kind that women in her situation did not recover from easily. But then every single morning the sun came up over the eastern fields, and there was still feed to put out, and the 2 remaining dairy cows still needed milking, and the fence on the north boundary still had a section down, and she was still there. She had not spoken to Zane Briggs in those 3 weeks. Not once. She had, however, watched him. He had taken up residence in the bunkhouse, the old falling-down structure that her father had built in 1861, and that had been occupied exactly twice in Elara's memory. Once by a traveling preacher who stayed 2 nights, and once by a Pawnee ranch hand named William who had worked the farm for 1 planting season before moving south. Zane had repaired the door, replaced 2 boards in the floor, and restored the small iron stove inside to working condition. She knew all of this because she had walked past the bunkhouse window one cold morning before dawn and seen the light and looked in. She was not proud of it. He worked. That was the thing she had not expected. She had assumed, in the bitter first week after the deed transfer, that he would simply take the property and sit back and let her either comply with the lease terms or leave. She had been imagining a vulture. Instead, what she got was a man who rose before daylight and went to work with a quiet, relentless efficiency that bordered on alarming. He had fixed the fence on the north boundary within 2 days. He had rebuilt the collapsed section of the hay storage barn in 4. He had cleared the drainage channel along the east field that had been clogged since spring and flooding the lower corn rows with standing water. He never asked for her help. He never commented on what she was doing with the land or how she was running it. He simply worked on the structural failures that had been accumulating for 3 years. Since her father died and her husband left and the money ran short, as if he were working through a list he had made privately and was checking items off in his own time. It made her furious. The specific flavor of fury that came from not being able to find a reasonable complaint. Elara Rowe had come to this farm at 17, a bride. She had left it once, briefly, at 22, when her husband Thomas Rowe had decided that Kansas farm life was not the life he had imagined, and had ridden out on the first Tuesday of March with their best horse and no goodbye note. She had come back to her father's land, by then renamed Rowe land, Thomas's name outlasting Thomas himself by a bitter irony, and had worked it alone. For 3 years she had worked it alone, and when her father's health declined in the final year, she had worked it and nursed him simultaneously. He had died in August of 1878, leaving her with the land and the debt, and the silence and the cattle that had dwindled from 12 head to 3, and the fields that had produced less each season as she had fewer and fewer hands and less money to keep the equipment running. She was 26 years old in October of 1878, which was when the Cattlemen's Bank of Colby sent their final notice. And 7 days later, Zane Briggs had appeared on her property with his horse, his bedroll, his dark coat, and a deed to her farm. She had asked around town. She was not so proud as to avoid asking around town. The woman who ran the general store in Colby, a sharp-eyed widow named Martha Crane, had told her what she knew about the man. He was called Briggs. He had come into Colby from the west, from Colorado, some said, or maybe further west than that. He had money, but he did not have the look of a man who came from money. He played cards in the saloon but did not drink heavily and did not get into fights. He had spoken to the bank manager twice before making his payment. He had asked about properties in receivership. He had specifically asked about the Rowe farm. That last piece of information had been the one that caught in Elara's chest like a splinter and stayed there. He had specifically asked about her farm. She wanted to know why. She wanted to know desperately, and the not knowing was worse than anything, worse even than the humiliation of the lease arrangement, because she could not work out what the dark motive was behind it. People did not buy failing Kansas farms for love of the land. People did not buy failing Kansas farms out of charity. There was a reason, and she was going to find out what it was. The opportunity came on a cold Thursday morning in the 4th week. She was carrying water from the pump to the cow shed when she rounded the corner of the barn and nearly walked straight into him. He was on his way to the tool storage, carrying a length of chain over one shoulder, and they stopped 6 inches apart, both startled, both caught in the awkward arithmetic of 2 people who had been carefully avoiding each other in a small space. "Excuse me," she said, her voice formal as a contract. "My fault," he said. She started to step around him. She stopped. She turned back. "Why this farm?" she asked. He looked at her. He had a face that had been weathered, she noticed. Not old. He was maybe 30, 31, but carved into its angles by years of outdoor living. There was a scar through the left eyebrow, gray eyes under dark brows, a jaw that was currently carrying 4 days of stubble. He was not handsome in the soft way that Thomas had been handsome. Thomas, who had been fair-haired and charming and utterly untrustworthy. Zane Briggs was the other kind, the kind that required you to look twice, the kind whose face added up to something more interesting the longer you looked at it. "It needed buying," he said. "That is not an answer. It's the only one I've got right now." She looked at him steadily. "There are 6 other properties in receivership within 20 miles of Colby. I know because the bank manager told me when he came with the final notice. He told me there were others in similar situations, as if that was somehow a comfort. So why this one? Why mine?" He shifted the chain on his shoulder. He looked past her for a moment at the fields, the frost-flattened grass, the gray October sky sitting heavy and low on the horizon. Then he looked back at her. "I'll tell you," he said, "but not today." "Why not today?" "Because today, I need to get the chain on the well pulley replaced before the temperature drops tonight and the rope freezes. And because I don't want to have the conversation I need to have with you standing in the mud between the barn and the cow shed." She stared at him. "Tomorrow," he said. "After supper, if you want to hear it." She wanted to tell him that she set the terms on her own property, on what had been her own property, and that she would determine the timeline for important conversations. She wanted to be angry and distant and icily in control of this situation. But the chain on the well pulley had been her next task for that week, and she had been dreading it because the iron ring had corroded and she hadn't been sure how to get it off without breaking the mechanism, and she was tired, and the cold was seeping through her coat. "Tomorrow," she agreed. She walked away before she could see whatever expression he was wearing, because she had the uncomfortable feeling it might be something gentle, and she was not ready for that. That night, alone in the farmhouse, Elara sat at the kitchen table with her father's Bible open in front of her and thought about the shape her life had taken. She was not a woman who wept easily. She had spent 3 years deliberately unlearning the habit, because weeping had never repaired a fence or kept a cow healthy or convinced a creditor to wait another month. But there were moments, in the deep quiet of late evening, when the accumulated weight of everything pressed down through her chest and settled somewhere beneath her sternum, and she had to simply sit with it. She had loved this land. That was the fundamental problem. If she had not loved it, she could have let the bank take it and moved on to something else, gone to Wichita, found work as a seamstress or a teacher, remade herself in a smaller but more manageable shape. But she had loved it fiercely, the way her father had loved it, and losing it had felt not like financial failure but like amputation. And now a stranger was sleeping in her bunkhouse, having bought it out from under her and offering it back at $1 a year. And she couldn't decide if he was rescuing her or trapping her. And either way she was staying, and the staying felt like its own kind of confession. She closed the Bible and went to bed. Supper the next evening was potatoes and the last of the salt pork and cornbread, because that was what she had, and she was not going to dress it up for anyone. She set 2 plates at the table because it would have been more pointed to set 1, and when Zane knocked at the door at 6:30, she opened it without ceremony and gestured at the table. He had cleaned up. That detail registered, despite her intention to not register details about him. He had washed and changed and combed his dark hair back, and the stubble was trimmed to something approximating intentional rather than neglectful. He sat down at the table across from her, and they ate in silence for several minutes, which was not uncomfortable in the way she had expected it to be. She had imagined the silence would be charged, difficult. Instead, it was surprisingly ordinary, just 2 people in a warm kitchen while the cold pressed at the windows. "You said you would explain," she said finally, around a piece of cornbread. He set down his fork. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, which was the gesture of a man gathering himself to say something honest, and she recognized it because her father had done the same thing. "I knew your father," he said. Elara's hands went still on either side of her plate. "We served together," Zane said. Late in the war, 64-65. He was a corporal in the 9th Kansas Cavalry, and I was attached to the same regiment for about 6 months. I was 17, he must have been about 35 by then. He never mentioned you, Elara said. Her voice had gone careful, neutral, the way she spoke when she was trying to prevent a reaction from showing. There's no reason he would have. I was a boy. He was one of maybe a dozen men who treated me with any decency during those months, and I don't know if he would have remembered it the same way I did. He looked up. I found out he died. I found out about the farm and about the debt and about the situation. A pause. I had the money. I had been carrying it for 2 years with no particular plan for it. This seemed like a plan. Elara looked at him for a long time. The lamp on the table threw warm light across the space between them. Outside, the wind had come up again, pressing against the walls of the house with that particular low moan that the Kansas plains generated in fall. "What was his name?" she asked. "In the way you knew him." "Henry," Zane said. "We all called him Henry. He had a habit of humming while he worked. Old hymns, mostly. He carried a photograph of a farm that he said would be the most beautiful thing I'd ever see in the spring." Elara's throat tightened. Her father had hummed. He had done it his whole life, ceaselessly, the same 5 or 6 hymns cycling through his afternoons and mornings, threading themselves through the sounds of her childhood. "That's why you bought it," she said. Not quite a question. "That's why I bought it," he said. "I wanted to make sure it stayed the way he wanted it to stay." She looked down at her plate. She picked up her fork and set it down again. She was not going to cry at her own kitchen table in front of a man she had known for less than a month. She simply was not going to. "You could have told me this at the start," she said, and she was proud of how steady it came out. "You would have thrown me off the property if I'd arrived with a sob story about your father in one hand and a deed in the other." She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she admitted, "I would have." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the approach of one, something loosening in the set of his jaw. "I needed you to see that I was going to work for it," he said. "That I wasn't just buying a piece of paper." "You've done good work," she said, and it cost her something to say it, but fairness required it. "The drainage channel alone was 3 years of flooding solved. I know. I looked at the field lines when I rode out before I talked to the bank." He picked up his fork again. "The soil on the east slope is better than you've been able to use. With the drainage cleared, you could run a full crop of winter wheat and have it turned before April." She looked up sharply. "How do you know about crop rotations?" "My family farmed," he said. "Colorado originally. Before." He didn't elaborate on the before, but the way he said it left a shape in the air around it, the shape of something that had ended badly. "Colorado," she repeated. "Is that where you were before you came here?" "Partly." She waited. He didn't continue. She recognized the architecture of that silence. He wasn't being evasive. He was being careful, which was different. There were parts of him he wasn't ready to explain yet. She understood that. She had her own parts like that. "The lease arrangement," she said instead, steering back to practicalities because practicalities were safe. "$1 a year. What does that actually mean legally?" "It means the land is mine on paper and yours in practice for as long as you want it." He met her eyes. "If I die or leave, I've made arrangements with an attorney in Wichita to transfer the deed back to you at no cost. The lease is protective for you, not for me." She stared at him. "You've already made those arrangements, week after I filed the deed." The lamp flickered as a gust hit the chimney. Elara sat with that information and tried to find something wrong with it, some angle of self-interest that she could point to and say, "There, that's the trap, that's the hidden motive." She couldn't find one. And the inability to find one was somehow more unsettling than if she had. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. Because you asked me a straight question yesterday, and you deserved a straight answer." She stood up and began collecting the plates, because she needed something to do with her hands. She carried them to the dry sink and stood there with her back to him. "You can stay in the bunkhouse as long as you're working the land," she said. "I won't pretend I don't need the help, and I won't pretend the work you've done hasn't been good." She turned. "But I need you to understand something. This is my farm. My decisions, my crops, my animals. You work it with me, not over me." He had stood when she stood, which was the reflex of a man who had been raised to some courtesy. He nodded once, serious, holding his hat in his hands. "Understood," he said. "Good," she said. "Then we have an early morning tomorrow because I need to assess the winter wheat planting, and I want your opinion on the east slope drainage before I decide on the row layout." He nodded again. He moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the latch. "Miss Rowe," he said. "Your father, he talked about you. Not often, but he did. He said you were the stubbornest person he had ever known and that he hoped you'd never lose it." He went out into the cold before she could respond. Elara stood in her kitchen and put a hand over her mouth and breathed carefully through her nose until the pressure behind her eyes subsided. Then she cleaned the dishes and went to bed and lay there for a long time listening to the wind and thinking about a 17-year-old boy in a war, and her father's voice humming an old hymn over the sound of cavalry horses. November came in cold and hard, which was usual for central Kansas, and with it came the work of preparation, the winterizing, the storage, the laying in of what would be needed before the deep freeze locked everything down. Elara had done this alone for 2 years, and she had done it adequately. She discovered, working beside Zane through those first genuinely cold weeks, what it felt like to do it well. He was efficient in the way that came from genuine knowledge rather than performance. He knew when to ask her and when not to, which she respected enormously. He asked her preferences on the East Field row layout and listened to her reasoning, and offered a modification that she considered and agreed with. He did not ask her about the cow shed maintenance because he could see that she had a system, and it was working. He asked her once about the storage root cellar, and they spent an hour down there together reorganizing the shelving, working in the lamp-lit underground cold, and she was aware the whole time of the specific quality of his attention. Focused entirely on the task, not on her, not in a way that felt like avoidance, but in a way that felt like respect. They ate supper together most evenings now. It had happened gradually, without announcement. He had brought venison one evening after a successful hunt, and she had cooked it because she was a better cook than he was. And afterward, they had sat at the table and talked about the winter wheat plan until the lamp burned low, and it had been the most natural thing she had experienced in years. She was careful. She was careful in the way that a woman who had trusted carelessly once was now careful by necessity. She monitored herself for the signs she had missed with Thomas, the way she had projected virtues onto him that he hadn't possessed, the way his charm had felt like depth when it was actually its opposite. She watched Zane for discrepancies, for the moments when the presented self would differ from the actual self, because that was where the truth always lived. She didn't find them. She found instead a consistent person, not a flawless one. He had a temper, she discovered, not directed at her but at equipment failures and weather delays, a short, fierce combustion that burned out quickly and left no residue. He disliked being asked to repeat himself, and she had learned to listen carefully the first time. He was not easy in crowds. She took him to town once for supplies and watched him move through the main street of Colby with his shoulders set, and his eyes tracking every door, the alertness of a man who had spent time in places where relaxing his guard had consequences. She asked him about it one evening. They were sitting after supper with coffee, real coffee, which they had splurged on at the general store, Martha Crane's best, and the fire was burning well, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the first actual snow was falling in small purposeful flakes. "You watch doorways," she said. He looked up from the cup he was holding, considered this. Habit, from before Colorado, a pause. The fire popped. Outside the snow fell in silence. "I did some work that wasn't always safe," he said carefully. "Carrying payroll for mining operations, mostly. And before that, I was with the marshal's office for a time, out of Denver." She absorbed this. "Were you a marshal deputy for about 3 years?" He turned the cup in his hands. "I left." "What made you leave?" He looked at the fire. She waited. "A man I brought in," he said at last. "On a robbery charge. The evidence was solid. I'd gathered it myself, spent 4 months on it. He hanged." He stopped. 2 years later, I found the evidence I'd missed. He hadn't done it. The kitchen was very quiet." "That's not your fault," she said carefully. "You worked with what you had." "I know that," he said. "I know it up here." He touched his temple briefly. "It's the other places it doesn't settle that are the problem." He looked at her. "I quit because I didn't trust my own judgment well enough anymore to keep putting men's lives against it." She understood this, she realized, in a bone-deep way that surprised her. The shape of it, the moment when confidence in one's own decisions collapsed from the inside, she knew that geography. Her own collapse had been different in its specifics, but the same in its architecture. The morning she had looked at her farm, 3 years in, and understood that she had been making decisions based on what she wished were true rather than what was, and that the gap between those two things was now measured in debt and dead cattle and an empty bunkhouse. "What did you do after you left?" she asked. "Moved around. Worked where there was work." A small pause. "Played cards, carried money, tried to figure out where I was supposed to be." "Did you figure it out?" He looked at her for a moment that stretched just slightly past ordinary. "I'm figuring it out," he said. She looked back at the fire and drank her coffee and did not examine the warmth that settled in her chest too carefully. December brought a full blizzard on the 4th, which was 3 days of complete immobility that Elara would have spent in cold isolation in previous years. She spent it instead in the farmhouse, which Zane had been slowly and unremarkably reinforcing against weather, new caulking on the window frames, insulation added to the door, and which was warmer than it had been in any December she could remember. He had come inside from the bunkhouse on the first day of the storm because the bunkhouse stove, while repaired, was not sufficient against a full 3-day blizzard. She had been brisk and practical about it, pointing him to the spare room that had been her father's and which now served as storage. He had cleared a corner, laid his bedroll, and had not made anything of the proximity. They played cards. She taught him to play a 2-person variant of whist that her father had developed over 30 years of winter evenings, and he beat her at it twice in 3 days, which infuriated her. She taught him to make her mother's molasses bread, and he got flour on his coat and found it funnier than she expected. They talked, really talked, the sustained circular kind of talking that covered everything from the price of wheat futures to the theological arguments that divided the 3 churches in Colby, to the question of whether the railroad that was supposedly coming through in 18 months would be a benefit or a disaster for small farms. On the 3rd evening of the storm, with the wind screaming at the roof and both of them tired of cards and bread baking, she got out the letters her father had kept. She had not planned to. She had opened the trunk in the spare room looking for an extra quilt, and the letters had been on top, tied in twine, and without thinking about it much she had carried them to the kitchen table. "He kept letters from the men he served with," she said, Setting them down, Zane looked at the bundle. "Would you mind if I looked?" he asked. "That's why I brought them," she said, which was honest and also more than she had meant to say. He untied the twine carefully. He sorted through them. She watched his hands, which were large and scarred and unexpectedly careful with old paper. He stopped at one, read it. His jaw shifted. "This is from me," he said. She had suspected it. "I know, I read them all when he died." She paused. "I didn't know the name then. I didn't know who Zane Briggs was." He looked at the letter. It was brief, she knew. She remembered it. Barely half a page. The handwriting of a young man still young enough to be unsure of the letters. It had said thank you in the inarticulate way of young men who didn't have the vocabulary for what they meant yet. It had said he hoped the farm was as beautiful as the photograph. It had said nothing else. He wrote back, Zane said. He wasn't asking. "The letter I found with yours," she said. "The unsent one." She reached past him and found it in the bundle. She recognized it by the different ink, lighter, her father's careful hand. He wrote it and didn't send it. "I don't know why." He unfolded it. She watched him read it. She had read it herself and knew what it said. The usual Henry Marsh business of telling a young man what the farm looked like in spring, and how the wheat came up, and that there was always work for good men who wanted honest employment. "Come by if you find yourself in Kansas," the letter said. "There would be a place for you." Zane folded it carefully and set it down. He was quiet for a long moment. "He didn't send it," he said. "No. And yet here I am," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. She looked at her father's handwriting on the page and felt the strange architecture of what had brought them here. The letter that hadn't been sent. The war that had shaped them both from opposite ends of 20 years. The debt and the deed and the door she had opened 3 weeks after the transfer with her hands shaking and her jaw set. "He would have liked you," she said. And then, because that felt unfinished, he would have approved of the drainage work specifically. He hated that flooding. She heard the soft exhale of something that was not quite a laugh but was in that vicinity. And when she looked up, Zane was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Open, unguarded, younger somehow, as if the careful weathered surfaces had briefly let something through. "Go to sleep," she said, because she needed him to go away before she said anything else. "The storm will break tomorrow and we'll have a week of work ahead of us." He stood, gathered the letters, retied them with the twine, and handed them back to her. "Thank you," he said, "for showing me." She took the letters back to the trunk and did not sleep for 2 hours. January and February were the long frozen months, the ones where the work of the farm contracted to its essential core, keeping the animals alive, keeping themselves warm, preventing the pipes from freezing and the roof from collapsing under weight of snow. In previous years, these months had been the hardest for Elara, the ones with the most silence and the least to show for effort. This year they were different. The practical work was lighter with 2 people, and the evenings stretched out with something she hadn't had in years: conversation, genuine and unhurried. She learned things about Zane Briggs in those long evenings by the fire. She learned that he had grown up on a farm near Pueblo, Colorado, with a father who was a decent farmer and a difficult man, and a mother who had died when he was 11. She learned that he had 2 younger sisters he hadn't seen in 6 years, which he spoke about with a flatness that covered something more complicated. She learned that he had a dry, precise sense of humor that surfaced unexpectedly, and that she found, to her mild alarm, genuinely funny. He learned things about her too. He was a good listener, the particular kind who asked questions not to fill silence, but because he actually wanted to know. She told him about Thomas with less pain than she expected, the wound having healed enough to examine honestly. She told him that the farm had saved her when Thomas left, which surprised her when she heard herself say it, because she had always framed it internally as the farm having trapped her. But saying it aloud in the firelit warmth of January, she understood it differently. "You could have left afterward," he said. "When he went." "I could have," she said. "Why didn't you?" She thought about it properly. "Because my father needed me. And because," she stopped, organized the thought, "because I didn't want Thomas leaving to mean I had to leave. I didn't want his decision to be the thing that determined my geography." Zane looked at her steadily. "That's a good reason. It's a stubborn reason." "Same thing," he said. "Sometimes." She smiled, which she was doing more of these days. She noticed it and decided not to analyze it. The closeness grew the way winter closeness does, slowly, then all at once. It was proximity and shared work, and the particular intimacy of people who had seen each other, exhausted and cold and frustrated and capable, who had worked side by side in bad conditions and come out to the other side of it, still able to sit across a kitchen table from each other at the end of the day. The moment it changed happened in early February, on an afternoon when she was treating one of the cows for a respiratory infection. The animal was distressed, pushing against the stall, and Elara was trying to hold the poultice in place while keeping herself out of range of the hooves, and she was losing on both fronts. Zane appeared behind her, moved past her with that unhesitating competence of his, got a shoulder against the cow's side, and held her steady long enough for Elara to complete the treatment. It was purely practical, nothing more. But afterward, when they were both leaning against the stall wall, both breathing hard, both covered in hay and significantly unpleasant cow-related material, they were shoulder to shoulder and neither of them moved away. "Thank you," she said. "You almost had it," he said. "I almost had a broken foot," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was something in the space between them that had not been there before, something that required acknowledgement or avoidance, and she was not ready for acknowledgement and had apparently lost the will for avoidance. She turned her head and looked at the cow instead. "We'll need to do this twice a day for 3 days," she said. "It's going to be easier with 2. "I know," he said. "I'll be here." He said it simply about the cow treatment, but it landed in her chest with a weight that was not simple at all. She did not sleep particularly well that night either. March came with mud, and the first tentative signs of the earth returning. The smell of it, that specific cold green smell that was the most hopeful thing Elara knew, the one that had repaired her every year of her life. The east field was clear, the drainage working beautifully, and the winter wheat she had planted in late October was coming up and clean. Even rows that made something loosen in her chest every time she walked the field boundary. She was walking it on a Tuesday morning in the second week of March, the mud pulling at her boots, the sky a clear, hard blue, when she heard a horse on the road. She looked up. 2 horses, actually, a rider she didn't know, leading a riderless horse. She watched them turn at her gate and come up the track and registered without pleasure that the rider she didn't know was wearing a badge. She had walked back to the house by the time the man dismounted. He was a county sheriff's deputy out of Salina, which was 60 miles east, and he had the look of a man who did his job and did not enjoy the parts of it that involved delivering information. "Miss Rowe," he said. "Yes," she said. "What can I do for you?" "I'm looking for a man called Briggs," he said. "Zane Briggs, is he here?" Her stomach tightened. "What's this about?" "A matter out of Salina County," the deputy said. "Nothing against him. We need him as a witness in a hearing. He's not in any trouble." She studied the man's face. He seemed honest. "I'll get him," she said. She found Zane in the tool shed sharpening implements. She stood in the doorway. "There's a deputy outside looking for you," she said. He went very still for a moment. Then he set down the file and stood. "Salina County?" he asked. She blinked. "Yes." "How did you know?" "I've been expecting it," he said. "There's a case out of Salina. I was a witness to something 2 years ago. They've finally brought it to hearing." He looked at her. "I need to go to Salina, probably a week, maybe more, depending on how the hearing goes." She absorbed this. The particular thing she felt about it was something she did not name. "Will you come back?" she asked, and she kept her voice neutral. He held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "I'll come back." She nodded and stepped aside to let him pass, and she stood in the door of the tool shed and watched him walk out to meet the deputy. And she felt the absence that was already forming around his presence like a silhouette. And she thought, with something between alarm and clarity, that she was going to miss him. He was gone 11 days. She worked the farm alone as she had done for 3 years, and it was fine. She was capable and the work got done. But the evenings were the thing. The evenings were very quiet in a way they had not been quiet for months, and she sat at the kitchen table after supper with her father's Bible or the farm ledger, and the silence pressed at her differently than it had before. Before, silence had been the natural state. Now it had a shape, defined by what was missing from it. She received a letter from him on the 5th day, which she had not expected. He was brief about the hearing. It related to a stagecoach robbery he had witnessed while carrying payroll, and his testimony was being used to corroborate another witness, and it was proceeding but slowly. The last paragraph was about the farm. He asked about the wheat, about the east field drainage, about whether the heifer he'd been monitoring for potential calving had shown any signs. He ended with, "I hope the evenings are not too quiet." The letter was signed simply Z. She read it 3 times. She wrote back. She wrote more than she intended to, about the farm, about the wheat, about how the heifer had indeed calved on the 7th night, and the calf was a bull and healthy and brown. She wrote about a morning she had walked the east field, and the sight of those clean, even wheat rows had filled her up in a way she couldn't entirely describe. She was 3 pages into it before she noticed the length, and she folded it and sealed it before she could reconsider. He came back on a Tuesday afternoon, which was 11 days after he'd left. She was in the garden when she heard the horse on the road and looked up and saw him on the ridge before he saw her. He looked tired, travel-worn, thinner somehow, the gray weather of the hearing still on him. And then he looked down and saw her, and something lifted in his face. She pretended not to see it. She pretended to still be examining the garden beds. She allowed him to come to her. "The wheat looks good," he said, coming up the slope from the track. "It's been a good 10 days for it," she said. She was still looking at the garden. "How was the hearing?" "Concluded. The man charged was convicted. My testimony held." He stopped a few feet from her. "How's the bull calf?" "Healthy, opinionated." She stood up from where she'd been crouched. She looked at him. "You look tired." "I am," he said honestly. "Then go wash up and I'll have supper ready in an hour," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that thing that was not quite a smile. "I got your letter," he said. She felt heat move up her neck. "I rambled," she said. "I read it 4 times," he said simply. She turned back toward the house before he could see whatever was happening with her face, and she heard him walking to the bunkhouse behind her. And she stood in the kitchen and pressed her hands against the cold of the dry sink and breathed deliberately until she could think clearly enough to cook. Spring arrived in earnest, and with it, the expansion of work that was the farm's best season. The wheat was coming in beautifully on the east slope, and they planted corn and kitchen vegetables, and repaired the south fence together across 3 long mornings. The calving season produced 2 more heifers from the older cows and Zane quietly acquired from a farm sale in the next county. A young bull to improve the stock, which he had discussed with Elara in advance, and which she had agreed to, and which had been a negotiation she had enjoyed. She was beginning to notice the details of him in a way she had been deliberately avoiding until now. The way he moved when he was fully engaged in a task, the economical physicality of it, nothing wasted. The lines at the corners of his eyes from years of reading distances outdoors. The way he handled the animals, particularly the younger ones, with a patience he hadn't inherited from anywhere that he described, but that was clearly in him. The way he listened to her. She had said this to herself before, but it continued to be remarkable, the quality of his attention. She was accustomed to being interrupted, dismissed, managed. He did none of these things. One April evening, she was sitting on the porch after supper watching the sky change colors over the flat line of the Kansas horizon, which was the finest free spectacle she knew. And he came out and sat on the step below her, and they watched the sunset together without talking, and it was one of the most comfortable things she had ever experienced, and she understood in that moment with complete clarity that she was in love with him. She sat with it very quietly for a long time. She had loved Thomas, or she had loved what she had understood Thomas to be, which was not the same thing, and she knew the difference now in her bones. What she felt about Zane was different from the root up. It was built on evidence. It was built on the character she had watched consistently, tested against difficulty and tedium and frustration, and found reliable. It was not hope or projection or the romantic misreading of charm. It was the specific, clear-eyed recognition of a person for what they actually were, and the finding that what they actually were was something she wanted to be near for the rest of her life. She was terrified. She was terrified in the rational way that came from having been wrong once, from having trusted the wrong architecture and watched it collapse. She was terrified in the additional way that came from knowing, now, the cost of love that failed. The farm had survived Thomas's departure. She was not sure she would survive this one if she let herself fully in and then lost it. He noticed the shift in her. She saw him noticing, which was its own particular torment. He became more careful, more deliberate, putting space between them at moments when they might otherwise have stood close. He was watching her figure out something and had the sense to let her figure it out. It broke one evening in late April. It was not dramatic in the way she might have scripted it. She was washing dishes and he was drying them, which had become their habitual arrangement, and she handed him a bowl and his fingers closed over hers for a moment on the transfer. Not holding, just the coincidence of hands, and she did not pull away immediately and neither did he. And then she looked up, and he was looking at her. "Elara," he said, just her name, quiet, careful, carrying all the weight of everything unsaid. "I need you to tell me something," she said, "all right. I need you to tell me that you're not going to leave." She kept her eyes on him. She was not going to be afraid of saying this out loud. She had spent 3 years being afraid of the wrong things. Not, I don't mean the farm, I mean here, I mean this. She gestured between them. "I need to know if you mean to leave." His expression had gone very still and very focused, the way it did when something mattered. "I came to Kansas," he said slowly, "because of a letter I didn't even receive from a man who died before I got here. I could have bought any of 6 properties in receivership, and I bought yours. I've been sleeping in a bunkhouse for 4 months when I could have found a room in town." He paused. "I am not going to leave." Her heart was beating so loudly she was fairly certain he could hear it in the quiet kitchen. "I need you to be sure," she said, "because I have been wrong before about what a person meant and I cannot." She stopped, started again. "I'm asking because it matters to me. More than I intended it to. And I'd rather know now if that's a mistake than—" "It's not a mistake," he said. He set the bowl down on the counter. He reached up and touched the side of her face with one hand, gentle and certain at once, the same way he handled everything that mattered. "Elara," he said again. She leaned into his hand by about half an inch, which was all she was prepared to admit to at that exact moment, and she saw him understand it and accept it and be patient with it. "Okay," she said quietly. He let his hand fall. He picked up the bowl and dried it. She turned back to the dishes. Her hands were shaking slightly, and the soap water was warm against them, and outside the evening was coming down over the Kansas plains in long amber light. "The north fence needs reinforcing before the summer run," she said. "I know," he said. "I was thinking we could use the timber from the fallen section of the old hay barn to offset the cost." "That's a good idea," she said. They finished the dishes. The days that followed had a different quality. Not dramatically different, but shifted at a cellular level, the way a house feels different when you know what's in every room. They were still working and still arguing about crop decisions, and still eating supper at the kitchen table, and still watching the sunset from the porch most evenings. But there was an honesty in the air between them now that hadn't quite been there before. The pretense of purely practical arrangements had dissolved. He kissed her for the first time on a May morning. She had been up on the fence rail checking the line of the new posts, and he had come up beside her to look, and she had said something about the angle of the second post being 2 degrees off, and he had said it was fine, and she had said she wanted it straight, and he had looked at her profile for a moment with a particular expression, and then kissed her cheek, brief and warm and entirely deliberate. She stood very still on the fence rail. "That post is still crooked," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll fix it tomorrow." She climbed down from the fence rail, and they walked the boundary line together, and she was smiling at the ground the entire time, and when she looked over, he was looking at the fence with an expression of a man who was also smiling, but had more practice at containing it. She kissed him back that evening on the porch, properly, with intention. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and she stepped up and put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him, and felt the moment when his surprise resolved into certainty, his hands coming out of his pockets to find her waist. Summer came in full and magnificent. The wheat harvest on the east slope was the best yield the farm had produced in its history, better even than her father's peak years in the early 70s, because the drainage solution had transformed the soil quality, and the row layout Elara and Zane had designed together in October had maximized the sunlight exposure. They sold the surplus at a price that covered not only the operating costs, but left a meaningful reserve, the first real reserve the farm had seen in 5 years. They spent some of it on a breeding pair of Hereford cattle, which was a considered investment that they discussed for 2 weeks before agreeing on. They spent some of it on repairs to the farmhouse roof, which had been gradually losing its battle against weather. They spent a small and specific portion of it on a wedding. It was not a large wedding. Martha Crane stood up as witness. The Colby minister was a quiet man named Reverend Douglas, who performed the ceremony in the church on a Saturday morning in July, when the heat was already pressing at the windows before 10 o'clock. Elara wore her best dress, which was blue cotton and had been let out and taken in so many times over the years that it was functionally a reconstruction of itself, and she thought it was the finest dress she had ever seen. Zane wore a coat that was new, she noticed, and had clearly been purchased in Wichita recently and with care. He looked at her when she walked up the aisle of the small church, and the expression on his face was one she was going to carry the rest of her life. They said their vows. They were traditional, because the traditional ones said what needed saying with a clarity that Elara respected. She said hers steadily, and she meant every word of them, specifically and deliberately, with full knowledge of what she was committing to and full acceptance of the weight of it. She saw in his eyes that he was doing the same thing, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Douglas said, and the small congregation, Martha, the deputy from the land office, two neighboring farm families they had come to know over the course of the spring, made the small kind sounds that small congregations make. Zane put his hands on her face in the same way she had put her hands on his face that first night on the porch, and he kissed her, and she kissed him back, and Martha Crane dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. They rode back to the farm together in the late morning, the heat settling over the plains in its full summer weight. And when they came over the ridge and she could see the east field running gold with the stubble of the harvested wheat, and the green of the corn plots coming in, and the farmhouse with its new roof sitting solid and purposeful at the center of it all, she felt something in her chest that was so large and so complete that it had no specific name. It was just the sum of everything, adding up correctly for the first time in years. "There it is," Zane said beside her, looking at the farm. "There it is," she said. The first year of their marriage was rich in the way that proper working partnerships were rich. Not easy, but deeply satisfying, with the specific rewards of things built together, and decisions made jointly and shared pride in work done well. The farm expanded by a modest increment. They took on the lease of the adjacent plot that had sat fallow since its owner moved east, and Elara's winter wheat program grew to fill it. Zane began breeding horses in addition to the cattle, a skill from his Colorado years that proved profitable. And the stable that had held her two remaining horses now held 8, with a regular trade running to farms and ranches across the county. They hired help in the spring planting season. 2 brothers from a Cherokee family who had settled north of Colby, Calvin and James Deere, who were good workers and became over the seasons something closer to trusted friends. Elara had been raised by a father who paid fair wages and made no distinctions in his treatment of men by their origin, and she ran her farm by the same principle, which was not universal in central Kansas in 1879, and which earned her some cold looks in town, and which she did not modify by a single degree. Zane backed her on this without requiring her to make the case for it, which was one of the things she loved about him, the way his moral instincts and hers aligned without having to be negotiated. He had seen enough of the world's injustices in his years with the marshal's office to have no interest in participating in them. Calvin and James respected him for this, and they worked well together, the 4 of them, through 2 good harvests and the gradual transformation of the Rowe farm into something that was starting to look like what Elara had believed it could be. In the fall of their first year, she found out she was expecting. She told Zane at the kitchen table after supper, which was where all the significant things in their lives seemed to be said. She was matter-of-fact about it because she was a practical person, but she watched his face with the particular attention she kept for moments that mattered, and what she saw there was a quality of joy she had not seen him express before, unguarded, immediate, uncontained by any of his usual measured surfaces. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Are you well?" he asked. "Do you feel well?" "Entirely well," she said. "I intend to keep working." "I know you do," he said. "I wasn't suggesting otherwise. I know you weren't." She turned her hand over under his. "What do you think?" Boy or girl, he thought about it. "Boy," he said. "Why?" "Because he'd grow up knowing how to do everything on this farm, and that's worth something." "Girls grow up knowing how to do everything on this farm," she said. "I know," he said. "I married one." His fingers tightened briefly on hers. Either way, she agreed. Their son was born in April of 1880, which was perhaps the finest spring Kansas had produced in a decade. He arrived at dawn after a labor that was neither brief nor easy, attended by the local midwife and by Zane, who had refused to leave the house, and who Elara, in the harder parts of the night, had been genuinely grateful to have there. Not hovering, not panicking, just steady and present in the way he was always steady and present when she needed him. The baby was healthy, dark-haired, and furious about the world's many injustices from the first moment. They named him Henry, which did not require discussion. Henry Marsh Briggs arrived on an April morning and was placed in his father's arms and looked up at Zane's face with the ancient, assessing expression of the newborn. And Elara, lying in the wreckage of the effort, watched Zane's face while he held his son and felt the absolute completeness of the moment like a physical weight. Zane looked up and found her watching. "Hello, Henry," he said, very quietly, addressing the baby but holding Elara's gaze. "Your grandfather would have liked you." She pressed her lips together. She was too tired to manage her face properly. "Don't do that," she said. "Sorry," he said, and he was smiling, and she was not crying. She was absolutely not crying. She was simply profoundly tired. The next year brought a drought. The summer of 1881 was brutal, the kind that turned Kansas from abundance to survival in the space of 3 months. Their corn crop failed and the wheat was reduced to half yield, and the spring-fed creek that ran the eastern boundary went to a trickle by July. It was hard. It was the hardest practical year since before Zane had come. And there were weeks in that summer when Elara came in at the end of the day too exhausted to eat, and Zane's jaw was set in the particular way that meant he was managing something difficult. But they managed. They had the reserve, the money saved from the 2 good years, and they had the horses, which were drought-proof, and they had the Hereford cattle that did better on dry range than the dairy stock. And they had each other, which was not a romantic abstraction but a very practical fact. 2 people who could make decisions quickly, divide the problem, implement solutions without wasting energy on argument or self-protection. The drought broke in August in a spectacular 3-day rain that turned the creek from a trickle to a proper run, and left the fields smelling of that clean earth smell that Elara associated with restoration. She stood in the rain in the east field on the second day, with her face turned up and the water running off her, and felt the relief move through her like something that had been wound very tight slowly releasing. She heard boots in the wet grass behind her. She knew his step. "You're going to get completely soaked," Zane said. "I know," she said. She didn't turn around. He stood beside her. She could hear the rain on his hat brim. "It's going to be fine," he said. "The wheat ratoon crop is already responding. We'll get a partial yield from the north field and the corn can be replanted for late harvest." "I know," she said again. "You're not standing in the rain because you're worried about the crops," he said. She turned and looked at him. The rain was steady, and they were both wet, and the field was green smelling under the gray sky. "I'm standing in the rain because it's raining and I am very happy about that," she said. He looked at her. He put his hands in his coat pockets and looked at her and did the thing he sometimes did, not quite a smile, but the thing that contained everything a smile meant. "Come in," he said. "Henry's awake." She followed him back across the wet field to the farmhouse and went in through the kitchen door, and there was Henry, 16 months old and mobile and opinionated and dark-haired, standing in the middle of the kitchen floor looking at them with his father's gray eyes. "Rain," she said to Henry, crouching down to his level, dripping on the floor. "Rain," Henry confirmed with great satisfaction. She picked him up, and he immediately grabbed her wet hair, and she laughed, and Zane took off his wet coat and hung it on the door, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of the afternoon's bread. And this was her life, and it was exactly the size and shape of the thing she had always been trying to build, only she hadn't known its exact dimensions until now. The years after the drought settled into the rhythm of the working farm, which was not a glamorous rhythm but was a true one. The farm grew. Not rapidly, not recklessly, but with the measured expansion of people who had learned the cost of overreach and the value of patience. By 1883, they were running 50 head of Hereford cattle and a stable of 20 working horses. The lease on the adjacent plot had been converted to a purchase, a real purchase in both their names, the deed drawn up in Wichita on a winter trip that also included what Elara privately considered their first real holiday. 2 nights in a hotel that had hot running water, which seemed like a fantasy after years of pump and kettle. Henry, at 3, was already following his father around the stable in a state of intense vocational certainty. He had determined that horses were the correct focus of a life well lived, and pursued this conviction with a persistence that made Elara recognize her own stubbornness in a new and slightly alarming context. She was pregnant again that winter. She told Zane on a January evening when the fire was going well and Henry was asleep and the house was quiet, and she watched his face go through the same unguarded joy as the first time, and felt that it had not diminished with familiarity. Boy or girl? He asked, and the question had become a ritual now. I think a girl this time, she said. Why? Because Henry needs a challenger and I need an ally, she said. He laughed. It was a good sound, his laugh. She had thought so from the first time she heard it, that December blizzard evening when she had beaten him at whist for the first time and he had laughed at the absurdity of it. And she had realized with mild shock that she liked the sound very much. Their daughter arrived in August of 1884, and she was indeed a girl, small and pink and entirely determined about her opinions from the first. They named her Clara, which was Elara's mother's name, and Clara grew her mother's coloring and her father's gray eyes, and combined both parents' stubbornness in a concentration that suggested the next 20 years would be extremely interesting. Life moved forward with its seasons and its work and its small accumulations of the kind of joy that was too ordinary and continuous to be called dramatic, but that was, in its quiet way, the most important thing. They had their difficulties. A harsh winter that killed 3 of the young horses, a legal dispute with a neighboring rancher over water rights that took 6 months to resolve in their favor, the gradual creaking appearance of age in the older farm structures that required constant maintenance. None of these things broke them. They bent, and then they came back upright, and the coming back was easier each time because they did it together. Zane wrote a letter to his sisters in the spring of 1882. It had taken him nearly 4 years of being at the farm to arrive at the point of writing it, which Elara understood and did not rush, because she knew the territory that old wounds occupied and the time they required. He had told her, over the course of their marriage, the fuller shape of his estrangement from them. A quarrel with his father after leaving the marshal's office, a silence that had calcified over years into something that felt permanent, the guilt of not knowing how to breach it without reopening everything that had caused it. He wrote the letter. It was brief, he told her, but it said what it needed to. He received a reply in June. He read it at the kitchen table, and she was in the garden with Henry, and when she came in, he was still sitting there with the letter in his hand, and his expression was the particular quality of a person processing something long overdue. They want to come visit, he said. Then tell them to come, she said. His sisters arrived the following autumn, Louise, who was 28, and Margaret, who was 25. And they were warm, forthright women who took in the farm and Elara and Henry with an openness that said they had been waiting for this reconciliation longer than the letters had suggested. There were conversations on the porch in the evenings that went late, and she stayed for some and stepped away from others, reading the difference and giving him the space he needed. She heard, from her bedroom window on the second night, the low sound of her husband's voice in the darkness outside and his sister's voice answering, and the occasional long silences between sentences, and she lay in the dark and was grateful for all of it. Louise and Margaret stayed 2 weeks. They left with warm embraces and promises to return in summer, and Zane stood on the track and watched their wagon down the road, and when he came back inside, he sat down and put his hands flat on the kitchen table in that gesture of gathering himself that she had learned in their first supper together. "Thank you," he said. "For what? For pushing me toward this." "I didn't push you toward anything," she said. "You did it yourself. You made it possible," he said. "Being here made it possible." He met her eyes, having something worth showing them. She sat down across from him at the table and covered his hands with both of hers. "They were very good company," she said. "They liked you considerably," he said. "Considerably." "Margaret said you were the only woman she could imagine managing you," he said, and the near smile was very present. "She's observant," Elara said. "I like her." They sat at the kitchen table in the afternoon light, and the farm moved around them in its autumn sounds. The cattle at the south pasture. Henry somewhere in the stable with Calvin, who had become a patient and excellent mentor to the boy. The wind in the grass outside the window. And it was ordinary, and it was everything. By 1885, Colby had grown with the railroad's arrival, which turned out to be the complicated mixed gift they had predicted in that first winter's conversation. The town doubled in size in 18 months, and land prices shifted dramatically, and several of the smaller farms were absorbed into operations that had no interest in the careful stewardship that made good farmland sustainable. Elara watched this with the focused concern of someone whose livelihood depended on the land's long-term health rather than its immediate sale value. She attended the first meeting of the Colby Farm Cooperative, an organization she had helped found, along with 3 other farm families including Calvin and James Deere's father, Thomas Deere, who had developed one of the best vegetable operations in the county. And she argued at length and with considerable force for land management practices that preserved the soil structure that the railroad's new inhabitants were inclined to strip farm for immediate yield. She did not win every argument. She won enough of them. Zane came to these meetings and sat in the back row and let her speak, which was what she needed from him in those contexts. He offered his opinion to her privately afterward, walking home, and his opinions were consistently useful, and she incorporated them into her strategies. This was the shape of their partnership, varied by context but consistent in its fundamentals. They strengthened each other, in different rooms and the same room, through different channels that fed the same end. Henry, at 5, had decided that he wanted to be both a horse breeder and a sheriff when he grew up, a combination that he described with great seriousness to anyone who would listen. He had his grandfather's humming, which Elara had first noticed when he was 2, the same unconscious threading of half-remembered music through the afternoon's work. She had told Zane about it one evening quietly, and he had gone very still for a moment and then nodded once. "I know," he said. "I've heard it. What do you think about that?" she asked. He thought for a moment. "I think Henry Marsh is well named," he said. She reached over and took his hand in the dark of the porch, and they sat together in the Kansas night with the stars in their usual extravagance overhead, and the sound of their son's humming drifting out from the open window where he was supposedly asleep. In the summer of 1886, Elara walked the east field on a Tuesday morning in July, which was a habit of hers that had never broken since the first spring when the wheat came up clean, and even after the drainage was fixed. She walked it at different seasons and different times of day, and each time it told her something different about the soil, the weather, the state of the operation. But mostly she walked it because it was the most beautiful thing she knew, this particular field. The way the light moved over it depending on the time of day and season. The way it smelled in different weathers. The way it had become the most reliable evidence of her own life working as it should. She heard boots in the grass, his step as familiar as anything. Zane came up beside her and they stood together at the top of the slope, looking down the field rows in the July morning light. "Calving count," he said. "4 healthy this week," she said. "No difficulties. Good." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the field. "Louise wrote, she's coming in September and bringing her husband. I know, I wrote her back." He looked at her sidelong. "You wrote to her?" "We have a correspondence," Elara said. "We have had one for 2 years. Is that a problem?" "Absolutely not," he said, and there was genuine warmth in it. "She told me you gave her advice about her garden. She said your advice was considerably better than mine." "She's right," Elara said. "You know, horses and cattle, vegetables are a different matter." He smiled, the full version, the one that had appeared gradually over the years as something in him had slowly and consistently released. She remembered the first winter, the careful closed surfaces, the measured quality of his attention to everything. She remembered the man who had looked at doorways. He still had that alertness. Some things that were built into a person by necessity did not entirely dissolve, but it had become something different in quality. It was awareness now rather than wariness. The difference was significant. "Come back in for breakfast," she said. "Henry is making something with the cornmeal that I suspect will require supervision." "He's 5, Zane said. "He shouldn't be cooking." "He disagreed with you strongly when you said that last week," she said. "So we've reached a compromise involving supervision and low surfaces." He fell into step beside her as they walked back toward the farmhouse, and the morning light was long and golden across the field, and the farm moved around them in its summer sounds, and she was aware of the particular feeling that was now so familiar she moved inside it like a second skin, but that she made a point of noticing regularly, deliberately, because she knew its value. She had almost lost this. She had been 3 weeks from the bank taking everything, from the slow dissolution of the thing her father had built, and she had maintained and loved and refused to leave. And then a man had appeared with a deed and a bunkhouse stove, and a work ethic, and a story about an unsent letter and gray eyes that saw things clearly. And she had been furious and suspicious and carefully watchful. And then gradually, against every defensive instinct she possessed, she had fallen completely in love with him. She was grateful for the stubbornness. Her father had been right about it. "What are you thinking about?" Zane asked. "They were nearly at the door, my father," she said. "And the letter?" He stopped at the porch step. She turned to look at him. "I think he would have sent it," she said. "I think he didn't send it because he wasn't sure you were ready and he was waiting. And then he ran out of time." Zane looked at her for a moment. "I wasn't ready then," he said. "I wasn't ready for any of this then." "I know," she said. "Neither was I." She paused. "We were ready at the right time." He looked at her with that expression, the open one, the one she had watched develop from barely visible to fully present over the years of their life together. Then he put a hand on the back of her neck and kissed her, unhurried in the July morning in front of the farmhouse that was hers and his and their children's and their futures. Henry's voice erupted from inside the kitchen with the specific tenor of a 5-year-old who had done something with cornmeal that was going to require significant cleanup. They pulled apart. Elara laughed. "Supervision," Zane said. "I told you," she said, and went inside. The farm grew into its best years through the late 1880s, each season adding to the accumulated reality of what they had built together. Clara, at 4, revealed a disposition toward animals that rivaled her brother's, with the modification that her particular interest was in the working cattle rather than the horses, and she followed Elara through the pasture routines with the focused gravity of a professional. Henry, who was 8 by 1888, had developed into a rider of genuine skill under his father's teaching and Calvin Deere's added instruction. And the quiet pride Zane took in the boy's development was the kind that didn't require saying aloud to be evident. Elara sat on the porch one October evening in 1888 and watched the last of the daylight go gold over the west fields and thought about the word impossible. She had thought, 3 years into her solitary management of this farm, that it was impossible to sustain it alone. She had thought, after the bank's final notice, that it was impossible to keep it at all. She had thought, after Thomas, that it was impossible to trust her own judgment about a person again. She had thought, after her father died, that it was impossible to be as lonely as she was and continue functioning. None of those impossibles had proven accurate. Zane came out and sat beside her on the porch bench. She leaned against his shoulder without announcing it, the easy, unconscious intimacy of a decade of evenings. He put his arm around her and they watched the last light drain out of the sky over the plains. "What are you thinking?" he asked. He always asked her this when she was quiet because he always wanted to know. "I'm thinking about the word impossible," she said. "What about it?" "I'm thinking it's usually wrong," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Usually," he agreed. The stars came out over Kansas in their slow, spectacular multiplication, the deep country stars that a city person never saw, and the farm sat quiet around them in the October dark. The cattle were settled in the south pasture. The horses stood in the warm stable. Henry and Clara were asleep in their rooms, Henry still sometimes humming in his sleep, a thin, persistent thread of it that Elara had learned to hear through the wall and that she associated entirely now with peace. Zane's arm was solid and warm around her, and his heartbeat was steady under her ear. And she thought about an October morning 8 years ago, when she had stood in this kitchen with her hands flat on a table over a deed she had not signed, and a man she had not trusted and had said, "Where am I supposed to go?" Nowhere, it turned out. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had been here all along.